There comes a moment in the life of the empath when something subtle yet irrevocable breaks not in the world outside, but in the invisible machinery of the psyche that has governed their devotion, their sacrifices, and their endless readiness to carry what was never truly theirs. This moment does not announce itself with drama. It arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the instant when a long-standing pain stops aching, not because it has healed, but because the nerves that once responded to it have grown tired of obeying. It is here, precisely here, that guilt begins to fail. And when guilt fails, a great psychological turning point has already begun. For many years, the empath lives under an inner law that is never consciously written, yet relentlessly enforced. This law says, if you feel bad enough, if you explain yourself thoroughly enough, if you soften your boundaries enough, then harmony will be restored, love will be preserved, and rejection will be averted. Guilt becomes the currency through which belonging is purchased. It is not moral guilt in the ethical sense, but a deeper, more archaic guilt, a bodily sensation that whispers, if I do not give, I will be abandoned. This guilt does not arise from wrongdoing. It arises from attachment. It is born not in adulthood, but in the earliest encounters between the child's sensitivity and the emotional atmosphere that surrounded it. In such a psyche, guilt is not an emotion, it is a mechanism. It operates automatically, without deliberation, compelling the individual toward accommodation, explanation, and self-erasure. When the empath senses tension in the room, they experience it not as an external event, but as an internal summons. Something in them feels responsible. Something in them feels summoned to repair, to soothe, to understand, to make themselves smaller so that others may remain intact. This is not kindness in its mature form, it is survival disguised as virtue. From the standpoint of depth psychology, this mechanism belongs to the realm of the mother and father archetypes. Long before these figures become personal parents, the archetypal parent is not merely the one who gives life, but the one upon whom life depends. When a child learns implicitly, not verbally, that love is conditional upon emotional attunement, guilt becomes the glue that holds the relationship together. The child senses that their feelings must be regulated to preserve connection. Over time, this develops into a personality orientation that prioritizes relational harmony over inner truth. What is crucial to understand is that guilt, in this context, is not conscious. The empath does not wake each morning deciding to feel guilty. Rather, guilt arises as a somatic response, a tightening in the chest, a subtle anxiety, a pull toward explanation whenever separation threatens. It is an ancient reflex, older than thought, rooted in the animal fear of exclusion. And because it operates below consciousness, it feels like morality. It feels like being good. It feels like being loving. Yet the psyche does not remain static. over the course of a life, unconscious strategies are tested against reality. And when a strategy no longer produces the psychic equilibrium it once did, symptoms begin to appear, fatigue emerges, resentment seeps in. The empath notices that their giving no longer brings closeness, but emptiness. Their explanations no longer create understanding, but further demands. Their guilt no longer restores peace, but deepens a quiet rage they do not know how to name. This is the beginning of the turning point. In the analytic hour, I have often heard individuals describe this phase as a strange numbness. They say, I still care, but I no longer feel compelled, or I know I should feel guilty, but the feeling doesn't arrive. This absence is deeply unsettling because guilt has functioned as a compass. Without it, the psyche feels unmoored. The individual may worry that they have become cold, selfish, or unloving, but from the standpoint of individuation, something far more significant is occurring. The self is withdrawing energy from a pattern that has outlived its usefulness. In Jungian terms, we might say that libido, psychic energy, is retreating from the persona that was built around being needed. The empath's identity has long been organized around responsiveness. Their sense of worth has been mirrored through others' dependence. When guilt stops working, this entire structure begins to collapse. And collapse, while terrifying, is also the prerequisite for transformation. The psyche does not dismantle a structure gently, it allows it to fail. At this stage, dreams often change. Where once the dreamer saw themselves rescuing, searching, or explaining, now they may dream of walking away from familiar houses, or standing silently while others speak. There may be images of locked doors, dry wells, or extinguished fires. These are not symbols of loss in the ordinary sense. They are symbols of withdrawal. The unconscious is signaling that energy is no longer flowing outward in the same direction. Something is being conserved. This conservation is not cruelty. It is necessity. You see, guilt belongs to the realm of the superego, the internalized voice of authority that tells us how to be acceptable. But individuation, the movement toward wholeness, requires a confrontation with this authority. At some point, the individual must ask, not verbally, but existentially, whose voice is this inside me? And when guilt no longer compels action, it is often because the psyche has recognized that this voice no longer corresponds to the self. The empath's turning point does not come through rebellion. It comes through exhaustion. The psyche simply can no longer sustain the cost of perpetual self-sacrifice. The nervous system, which has been finely tuned to others' emotional states, begins to shut down its responsiveness. This is not pathology. It is protection. Just as a muscle fatigues after overuse, the empathic system withdraws when it has been exploited, often not by others alone, but by the individual's own unconscious patterns. This is why guilt loses its power, not because the empath becomes immoral, but because guilt has been revealed as a tool of self-betrayal. At first, this revelation is accompanied by fear. The empath wonders, if I no longer feel guilty, who will I be? The persona answers, you will be abandoned. But the self responds differently. The self says nothing at first. It allows the fear to exist without resolving it. This silence is crucial. For the first time, the empath does not rush to repair the discomfort. They sit with it. They do not explain it away. They do not apologize for it. And in this sitting, something profound begins to emerge, a center that does not depend on reaction. This center is not ego. It is not pride. It is not indifference. It is the self experienced not as an idea, but as a quiet solidity beneath the fluctuations of approval and disapproval. When guilt ceases to function as a motivator, the empath is forced to encounter this center. There is no longer an automatic script to follow. Choices must now arise from inner necessity rather than external pressure. This is why relationships often change dramatically at this juncture. Those who have unconsciously relied on the empath's guilt will experience this shift as abandonment. They may escalate demands, provoke emotional reactions, or accuse the empath of becoming selfish. These reactions are not evidence that the empath has done something wrong. They are evidence that a system has been disrupted. When one person withdraws from an unconscious contract, the other feels destabilized. Here, the empath faces a decisive psychological test. If they re-enter guilt to restore equilibrium, the old pattern will resume. If they tolerate the anxiety of separation, a new configuration becomes possible. This tolerance is not stoicism, it is endurance. It requires the capacity to feel distress without immediately transforming it into action. And this capacity marks the threshold of maturity. In alchemical symbolism, this stage corresponds to Nigredo, not because everything is dark, but because familiar meanings dissolve. The empath no longer knows how to be who they were. They have not yet discovered who they are becoming. The temptation at this stage is to interpret numbness as failure. But in truth, numbness often precedes reorientation. When the psyche withdraws feeling from a pattern, it creates space for new forms of relatedness to emerge. What emerges next is not hardness, but clarity. As guilt recedes, perception sharpens. The empath begins to notice how often their past generosity was not met with reciprocity, but with entitlement. They see how their explanations were not misunderstood, but ignored. This seeing can be painful because it shatters the fantasy that understanding alone could redeem relational imbalance. Yet this pain is necessary. Without it, the empath would remain trapped in a cycle of hope and disappointment. At this point, the shadow enters the field of awareness, not as aggression, but as firmness. The empath may feel impulses to say no, to remain silent, to leave without explanation. These impulses often provoke inner conflict because they contradict the empath's moral self-image. But from a Jungian perspective, these impulses, when the psyche withdraws feeling from a pattern, It creates space for new forms of relatedness to emerge. What emerges next is not hardness, but clarity. As guilt recedes, perception sharpens. The empath begins to notice how often their past generosity was not met with reciprocity, but with entitlement. They see how their explanations were not misunderstood, but ignored. This seeing can be painful because it shatters the fantasy that understanding alone could redeem relational imbalance. Yet, this pain is necessary. Without it, the empath would remain trapped in a cycle of hope and disappointment. At this point, the shadow enters the field of awareness not as aggression, but as firmness. The empath may feel impulses to say no, to remain silent, to leave without explanation. These impulses often provoke inner conflict because they contradict the empath's moral self-image. But from a Jungian perspective, these impulses represent the integration of previously disowned qualities, boundaries, autonomy, self-assertion. Without them, the personality remains one-sided, vulnerable to exploitation. To integrate the shadow does not mean to become cruel. It means to allow oneself to exist without justification. And this is precisely why guilt must fail. As long as guilt functions, the empath remains oriented toward others' emotional states rather than toward their own psychic truth. When guilt loses its grip, the empath can finally ask a different question. Not, how can I fix this, but what is true for me? This question marks the beginning of a new axis of orientation, one that no longer revolves around appeasement. From this axis, a different kind of compassion becomes possible, one that does not sacrifice the self, but that lies beyond the threshold we are now examining. For now, it is enough to recognize that when guilt stops working, it is not the end of empathy. It is the end of empathy as self-abandonment. And it is here, precisely here, that the turning point begins. The psyche does not rush forward once this threshold is crossed. It lingers. It circles. It tests the ground. After guilt loses its immediate authority, there is often a long, ambiguous interval in which the empath feels suspended between two worlds. The old reflex to explain, to rescue, to soften oneself has not entirely disappeared, yet it no longer feels inevitable. At the same time, a new orientation has not fully taken shape. This interval is experienced not as triumph, but as disorientation. The empath may say, I no longer recognize myself, or I feel strangely empty, as if something essential has gone missing. But what has gone missing is not essence, it is compulsion. In analytical terms, this is a withdrawal of projection. For many years, the empath projected their sense of purpose into the emotional needs of others. They lived as though their value existed outside themselves, confirmed only through usefulness. When this projection is withdrawn, the world appears suddenly flatter, less charged. Relationships that once felt intense now feel strangely hollow. This can be misinterpreted as depression. But there is a difference between depression and the removal of illusion. Depression drains life of meaning. Withdrawal of projection removes borrowed meaning so that a more authentic one may eventually arise. During this phase, dreams often depict empty rooms, abandoned villages, or long corridors with no apparent destination. These images are not signs of psychic decay, they are transitional landscapes. The unconscious is clearing space. Just as a forest fire makes room for new growth, the psyche dismantles what can no longer sustain development. The empath, however, is unused to emptiness. They have been trained to fill space with concern, to occupy silence with explanation. Now silence confronts them, and it demands to be endured. Here, the danger is not that the empath will become selfish, but that they will panic and regress. The anxiety of this stage is subtle but pervasive, without guilt to guide action. The individual must rely on something far less familiar, inner necessity. But inner necessity speaks quietly. It does not shout like guilt. It does not threaten abandonment. It simply waits. Learning to listen to it requires patience. And patience has rarely been cultivated in a psyche accustomed to immediate relational repair. This is the moment when the archetype of the orphan becomes active, not the literal orphan, but the symbolic one, the figure who must survive without immediate protection, who must discover inner resources rather than rely on external reassurance. The empath often resists this archetype fiercely. They may seek new causes, new relationships, new forms of service in an unconscious attempt to re-establish the old economy of guilt and redemption. But the psyche, having reached this turning point, resists these substitutions. What is demanded now is not replacement, but reorientation. It is important to understand that guilt, in its archaic form, is tied to the fear of separation. The child learns early that separation threatens survival. As an adult, the empath may no longer depend materially on others, but the emotional memory remains. Guilt functions as a bridge, keeping the empath tethered to the relational field. When this bridge collapses, the individual must face the primal fear of being alone, not in the social sense, but in the existential sense. This fear is not pathological, it is universal. But the empath has avoided it for a long time by dissolving themselves into others. In the absence of guilt, a new sensation often arises: indifference. This indifference is deeply misunderstood. It is not apathy, nor is it cruelty. It is the psyche's way of signaling that the old emotional investment has been withdrawn. The empath may notice that others' disappointment no longer pierces them as it once did. Where previously there was an immediate contraction in the body, now there is a pause. This pause is the space in which consciousness can enter. Without it, choice is impossible. From a Jungian perspective, this pause marks the emergence of the observing ego, a stance that can witness emotional dynamics without being immediately consumed by them. This observing capacity is essential for individuation. Without it, the individual remains fused with archetypal patterns, acting them out rather than reflecting upon them. Guilt dissolves this capacity by compelling immediate response. Its weakening, therefore, is not a moral failure, but a psychological gain, yet the psyche is ambivalent about this gain. The empath may experience waves of nostalgia for the old self, the one who felt indispensable, needed, morally superior in their capacity to endure. There is a quiet seduction in martyrdom. To suffer for others provides a sense of meaning that is difficult to relinquish. When guilt stops working, the empath loses not only a coping mechanism, but an identity. This loss must be mourned. Mourning, however, is not the same as regret. To mourn is to acknowledge that something once served a purpose, even if it has now become destructive. The empath's guilt was not a mistake. It was an adaptation. It allowed the individual to survive emotionally in an environment where attunement was required for safety. But adaptations, when carried beyond their proper context, become prisons. The psyche, in its wisdom, seeks liberation not through condemnation of the past, but through transcendence of it. As guilt weakens, the shadow becomes increasingly visible not as aggression, but as refusal. The empath begins to experience a capacity to say no without explanation, to remain silent when provoked, to withdraw when overwhelmed. These behaviors often trigger intense internal conflict because they violate the empath's internalized image of goodness. But goodness, when defined solely as self-sacrifice, is a distortion. True ethical development requires differentiation, the ability to recognize where one ends and another begins. This differentiation is often accompanied by a re-evaluation of relationships. The empath may begin to see that some bonds were sustained primarily through guilt rather than genuine mutuality. This realization can be painful because it exposes the asymmetry that was previously obscured by idealization. Yet this pain is clarifying. It reveals which relationships can survive without guilt and which cannot. Those that cannot often dissolve. This dissolution is not a punishment. It is a natural consequence. Relationships that depend on unconscious contracts cannot endure conscious individuation. When the empath stops paying with guilt, the cost of the relationship becomes visible, and not all are willing or able to renegotiate on new terms. At this stage, this internalized image of goodness, but goodness, when defined solely as self-sacrifice, is a distortion. True ethical development requires differentiation, the ability to recognize where one ends and another begins. This differentiation is often accompanied by a re-evaluation of relationships. The empath may begin to see that some bonds were sustained primarily through guilt rather than genuine mutuality. This realization can be painful because it exposes the asymmetry that was previously obscured by idealization. Yet this pain is clarifying. It reveals which relationships can survive without guilt and which cannot. Those that cannot often dissolve. This dissolution is not a punishment, it is a natural consequence. Relationships that depend on unconscious contracts cannot endure conscious individuation. When the empath stops paying with guilt, the cost of the relationship becomes visible, and not all are willing or able to renegotiate on new terms. At this stage, many empaths report a sense of internal quiet that is both relieving and unsettling. There is less drama, fewer emotional highs and lows. Life feels simpler, but also less intense. This reduction in intensity can be misinterpreted as loss of vitality. But intensity is not the same as depth. Often, what passes for depth in empathic over-involvement is merely emotional entanglement. True depth emerges later, after differentiation has occurred. In the symbolic language of alchemy, this stage corresponds to the washing away of impurities. The psyche is not yet whole, but it is no longer dominated by compulsive patterns. The empath stands in a kind of psychic clearing, uncertain but more grounded. They are learning to tolerate the absence of immediate meaning, trusting that something new will eventually crystallize. What crystallizes is not a new role, but a new relation to the self. Without guilt dictating behavior, the empath must confront their own desires, not the socially approved ones, but the quiet, often neglected impulses that were previously sacrificed. This confrontation can be disorienting because the empaths may not know what they want. Desire, long subordinated to obligation, has atrophied. Reawakening it requires time and patience. This is why the turning point is not a moment, but a process. Guilt does not disappear overnight. It fades, returns, tests the psyche, and fades again. Each time it returns, it does so with less authority. The empath learns gradually that nothing catastrophic happens when they do not respond to guilt. The feared abandonment does not occur in the way imagined. And when it does occur, when someone leaves or withdraws, it reveals itself as survivable. Survivability is a crucial discovery the empath learns, not intellectually, but experientially, that they can endure separation. This endurance is the foundation of autonomy. Without it, individuation remains theoretical. With it, a new form of relatedness becomes possible, one that is chosen rather than compelled. At this point, the psyche begins to shift its center of gravity, no longer oriented primarily toward external approval. It turns inward, seeking alignment with the self. This inward turn is not narcissistic, it is restorative. It allows the empath to reclaim psychic energy that was previously scattered across others' needs. This energy does not immediately find expression. It gathers, consolidates, waits. And it is from this gathered energy that a new ethic eventually emerges. An ethic not based on guilt, but on responsibility. Responsibility, unlike guilt, does not demand self-erasure. It asks for conscious choice. It recognizes limits. It acknowledges that one cannot save everyone without losing oneself. But this ethic belongs to the next phase of the journey. For now, it is enough to remain with the fact that when guilt stops working, the empath does not become less human. They become more real. And reality, though less dramatic than fantasy, is far more sustainable. The turning point, therefore, is not an end, but a reorientation, a subtle, profound shift from being driven by fear of loss to being guided by inner truth. And once this shift has begun, it cannot be undone. As the psyche settles into this new orientation, something unexpected often occurs. The empath begins to sense a different kind of tension, not between themselves and others, but within themselves. This tension is quieter, more intimate, and therefore easier to avoid. It is the tension between who they have been and who they are becoming, without guilt to dictate behavior. The empath must now confront a question that has long been deferred. Not how to be good, but how to be whole. Wholeness, however, is not a moral concept. It is a structural one. It requires the inclusion of elements that were previously split off in order to preserve attachment. For the empath, these elements often include assertiveness, self-interest, anger, and the capacity to disappoint others without collapsing internally. These qualities were not absent. They were repressed. They lived in the shadow, accumulating energy through neglect. Now, as guilt loosens its grip, this shadow energy begins to surface, not explosively, but insistently. The empath may notice sudden irritation where once there was patience, or a firm inner no, where there was automatic compliance. These experiences can feel alarming because they contradict the empath's self-image as gentle, understanding, and accommodating. Yet from a depth psychological perspective, this is not corruption. It is compensation. The psyche, having been one-sided for too long, seeks balance. The appearance of these qualities is not a regression, but a correction. Here, it is essential to distinguish between anger as a reactive emotion and anger as a boundary signal. In its shadow form, anger is destructive and impulsive. In its integrated form, anger is clarifying. It marks the point at which the self has been encroached upon. Many empaths were taught implicitly that anger endangered attachment. As a result, anger was disowned and replaced by guilt. When guilt weakens, anger often reappears, not as violence, but as firmness. It says, "This is where I end, ist." This firmness introduces a new psychological economy. Previously, the empath's relationships were governed by unconscious exchanges of guilt and reassurance. Now, a different currency emerges, presence. The empath begins to engage with others, not through explanation, but through embodied clarity. They may speak less, but when they do speak, their words carry more weight. Silence becomes a form of communication, not a withdrawal of love, but a refusal to participate in distortion. This shift can be profoundly unsettling for those around them. People who have grown accustomed to the empath's responsiveness may experience this new stance as coldness or rejection. They may accuse the empath of changing, of becoming distant, of losing their compassion. These accusations often confirm the depth of the shift. When guilt was operative, the empath would have rushed to repair such perceptions. Now, they notice the accusation without immediately responding to it. This restraint is not indifference, it is discernment. From the standpoint of individuation, discernment is a higher function than appeasement. It requires the capacity to tolerate ambiguity, to allow others to have their own interpretations without assuming responsibility for them. This capacity marks the emergence of psychological adulthood. The empath is no longer operating primarily from the child's fear of displeasing the parent archetype. They are beginning to relate from a more differentiated position. This differentiation, however, often brings loneliness, not the acute loneliness of abandonment, but the quieter loneliness of standing apart. The empath may feel as though they are observing life from a slight distance. When guilt was operative, the empath would have rushed to repair such perceptions. Now, they notice the accusation without immediately responding to it. This restraint is not indifference, it is discernment. From the standpoint of individuation, discernment is a higher function than appeasement. It requires the capacity to tolerate ambiguity, to allow others to have their own interpretations without assuming responsibility for them. This capacity marks the emergence of psychological adulthood. The empath is no longer operating primarily from the child's fear of displeasing the parent archetype. They are beginning to relate from a more differentiated position. This differentiation, however, often brings loneliness, not the acute loneliness of abandonment, but the quieter loneliness of standing apart. The empath may feel as though they are observing life from a slight distance, no longer fully immersed in relational drama. This distance can feel alienating, especially for someone whose identity was built around emotional intimacy. Yet, this distance is necessary. It creates the space in which genuine intimacy, free from compulsion, can later arise. At this stage, the psyche often turns toward symbols of sovereignty. In dreams, the empath may encounter images of solitary figures, wanderers, hermits, guardians at gates, or individuals standing on thresholds. These figures represent not isolation, but authority. Authority here does not mean control over others. It means authorship over one's own inner life. The empath is learning to inhabit this authority, awkwardly at first, with uncertainty and self-doubt. Self-doubt is inevitable, because the old internal reference points have dissolved. The empath no longer measures themselves by how much they give, how much they endure, or how indispensable they are. Without these metrics, the psyche must develop new criteria for self-evaluation. These criteria emerge slowly, through lived experience rather than ideology. The empath begins to notice what drains them and what sustains them, what feels aligned and what feels invasive. These sensations become the new compass. Importantly, this compass does not operate on moral absolutes. It does not label others as good or bad. Instead, it asks a simpler, more demanding question. Is this relationship reciprocal? Reciprocity here does not mean equality in form, but balance in energy. The empath begins to sense when giving flows naturally and when it is extracted through subtle pressure. This sensing is not intellectual, it is bodily. The nervous system, no longer overridden by guilt, regains its capacity to signal safety and threat. This is a profound shift. For many years, the empath ignored bodily signals in order to maintain relational harmony. Now, the body reasserts itself as a source of truth. Tightness, fatigue, and irritation are no longer dismissed as personal flaws. They are recognized as information. This recognition marks a re-embodiment of the psyche. The empath is no longer living solely in the emotional field of others, but inhabiting their own somatic reality. As this embodiment deepens, the empath may experience moments of unexpected joy, not the ecstatic joy of approval, but a quieter satisfaction that arises from congruence. They may find pleasure in solitude, in activities that have no relational function, in simply being rather than doing. This pleasure can feel almost transgressive because it is not earned through sacrifice. Yet it is precisely this unearned pleasure that signals a return to the self. From an alchemical perspective, this stage corresponds to albedo, the whitening, after the darkness of nigredo, where old forms dissolve. Albedo brings clarity and purification. The psyche is not yet unified, but it is more transparent. The empath begins to see themselves more clearly, without the distortions imposed by guilt and projection. This clarity is not always comfortable. It reveals both strengths and limitations, but it is honest. Honesty, in this sense, is not confession, it is alignment. The empath learns to act in accordance with their inner state rather than against it. This alignment reduces internal conflict. Decisions, once agonizing, become simpler not because there are no consequences, but because the criteria for choice are clearer. The empath no longer asks, will they be upset, as the primary question. Instead, they ask, can I live with myself if I do this? This question signals the emergence of a new ethical center, one rooted in the self rather than in external approval. It does not guarantee harmony with others, but it offers coherence within. And coherence, once established, exerts a quiet influence on the surrounding environment. Relationships that can adapt to this coherence deepen. Those that cannot often fall away. This falling away can be painful, but it is also liberating. The empath begins to recognize that not all connections are meant to be preserved indefinitely. Some exist to teach a lesson, to activate a pattern, to be outgrown. Guilt, in its archaic form, insists on preservation at all costs. Individuation recognizes the necessity of endings. As this recognition takes hold, the empath's emotional life becomes less reactive. They are less easily drawn into others' crises. They listen without absorbing. They care without collapsing. This balance is not achieved through technique, but through structural change. The psyche has reorganized itself around a different center of gravity. Yet, this reorganization is not complete. There remains a final tension, one that emerges only after guilt has lost its power and the self has begun to assert itself. This tension concerns meaning without the old narrative of being needed. The empath must now ask, what is my life for? This question cannot be answered through service alone. It requires a deeper engagement with one's own destiny. And it is here, at the edge of this question, that the journey moves toward its final transformation. When the question of meaning arises in this way, it does not arrive as an idea to be solved, but as a pressure within the psyche. The empath feels it as a quiet insistence, a sense that something essential is waiting to be lived rather than explained. For much of their life, meaning was borrowed. It came from being useful, from alleviating pain, from stabilizing emotional fields that threatened to collapse. Now that guilt no longer compels these roles, meaning must be generated from a deeper source. This is an unfamiliar demand, and it often provokes anxiety because it cannot be satisfied through immediate action. At this stage, many empaths experience a subtle grief that is difficult to articulate. It is not grief for a specific person or event, but for a version of life that will never return. The fantasy of being indispensable, of being redeemed through sacrifice, of being loved for one's endurance, this fantasy must be relinquished. The psyche resists this relinquishment, not because the fantasy was true, but because it provided orientation. Without it, the empath must face a more frightening freedom, the freedom to choose a life that is not organized around others' needs. This freedom is frightening because it exposes responsibility. When guilt dictated action, the empath could attribute their choices to obligation. Now, choice becomes personal. To choose solitude, rest, or self-expression is no longer justified by necessity. It must